The orc girl was publicly broken, until a stranger whispered, "You're mine." Torchlight shook across the market square as rain turned dust to black mud. At the center, an orc woman knelt in broken chains, her shoulders forced down by two guards, while the crowd shouted for her to lower her head. Blood ran from the corner of her mouth. Someone tore away her hood, and the square erupted at the sight of her tusks, her scars, her proud face dragged into public ruin. She looked like a warrior being made into an animal. At the edge of the crowd stood a poor human laborer with empty hands and nothing worth losing except the little dignity he had left. He should have looked away. Instead, he stepped forward, pushed through the noise, and dropped to one knee beside her. When her furious, shattered gaze met his, he leaned close and whispered, "You're mine." The square fell silent. He lived in the part of the border town that decent people crossed quickly and forgot by morning. His room sat behind a cooper's yard, above a narrow shed where broken barrels, bent wheels, and cracked tool handles were thrown until someone paid to mend them. Most days, he worked from dawn until the light failed, repairing what other people considered too cheap to care about: harness straps, cart pegs, split stools, rusted hinges, winter boots with holes in the soles. He was not a warrior, not a merchant, not a man anyone greeted twice. He was simply useful when something was damaged, and invisible the moment it was whole again. The little space he rented matched the life he had built out of scraps. One bed, one stool, a workbench crowded with thread, awls, nails, oilcloth, and bundles of dried herbs tied above the window to keep out damp. The roof leaked in two places when it rained hard. The stove smoked if the wood was too green. It was not a place made for comfort, only survival. That night, survival followed him home in chains. The square still echoed behind them as he led. The orc woman through a maze of alleys, away from torchlight and shouting. She stumbled once, but did not ask for help. Even half-broken, she moved with a dangerous kind of pride, as if every step she took was a refusal to die in front of witnesses. Mud clung to her torn boots. Blood darkened the side of her face. The iron marks around her wrists were raw and swollen where the guards had pinned her down. He had saved her the only way he could think of, not by fighting, not by heroics, by lying. He had thrown his last coins onto the magistrate's table and spoken quickly enough to make the crowd hesitate, claimed her as his responsibility, his purchase, his burden, anything that gave the guards a reason to let go of her and move on. He hated the memory of the words already. He hated more that they had worked. When he pushed open the door to his room, she stopped at the threshold and stared inside, as if she could not understand how a man lived in something so small. Her shoulders nearly filled the doorway. She had to duck her head to enter. The room seemed to shrink around her. He set down his tool bag and reached for the kettle with careful slowness. "There's water," he said, "and broth if the stove relights." She did not sit. "Why did you say that?" Her voice was rough, low, and edged like scraped metal. "In the square." He kept his eyes on the stove, not her tusks, not the bruises forming along her jaw. "Because they were hurting you." "That is not an answer." He struck flint, waited for the spark to catch, and only then looked at her. "It is the only one I have." For a moment, she just stared. He could feel the danger in her, even exhausted as she was. The reach of her arms, the strength still left in her shoulders. If she decided he had traded one humiliation for another, this room would become his grave. But instead of lunging, she looked away first. In the firelight, details emerged that did not belong to an ordinary fugitive. The leather at her shoulder had once been fine, stitched with a pattern too precise for common soldiers. Around one wrist, beneath grime and swelling, he glimpsed a band of dark metal engraved with symbols. He did not know. Even the way she stood, injured, cornered, silent, felt disciplined. Not wild, not simple, important. She caught him noticing and tugged the torn sleeve down. He handed her a chipped cup of water and stepped back. She took it after a pause, as if accepting anything from him offended some deeper rule. Then she drank like someone who had been denying her body for too long. He did not ask her name. She did not offer it. Rain tapped softly against the window. The fire gave just enough heat to turn the room gold at the edges. Across from each other in that poor, narrow space, they looked like something impossible, a forgotten human mender and a wounded orc woman who carried herself like fallen royalty. Even before either of them understood the full danger of it, the truth already hung between them. Their worlds should never have met. And now neither of them knew how to walk away. The first night passed without rest for either of them. He lay near the door with his rolled coat beneath his head and a knife so old and dull it was more comfort than weapon. She remained awake by the dying fire, sitting upright despite the tremor in her arms, as if sleep itself were a surrender she could not afford. Several times he woke to find her watching him, not with gratitude, but with the hard, measuring stare of someone trying to decide whether mercy was simply another trap. By morning, the truth of her condition was impossible to ignore. One of her ribs was likely bruised or cracked. The skin around her wrists had been rubbed raw by iron. There was a deep cut high along her side, where her torn armor had hidden the worst of the blood. When he reached for fresh water and clean cloth, she caught his wrist so quickly his breath stopped. Even hurt, her grip was powerful enough to remind him how easily she could break him. "I won't have you touching me like a captor," she said. He swallowed, gently set the cloth down within her reach and nodded. "Then do it yourself," she tried. He watched her jaw tighten as she peeled ruined leather from the wound at her side, and he could tell from the angle alone that she could not clean it properly. She knew it too. For a long while, pride held the room still. Then, with visible disgust at needing anyone, she pushed the cloth toward him. He said nothing. That seemed to matter. He worked carefully, as he did with split harness straps and cracked handles, with patience instead of force. He washed blood from green skin, cleaned grit from torn flesh, wrapped her ribs with strips of linen, and laid a bitter-smelling paste over the worst bruise. She hissed once when his fingers pressed too near the wound, and he drew back at once. He expected anger. Instead, after a few breaths, she muttered, "Finish it." So he did. The days that followed settled into a tense, strange rhythm. He rose before dawn, took whatever repair work he could find, and returned with wood, stale bread, and whatever scraps of meat or root vegetables he could afford. He told himself each extra coin spent on her recovery was temporary. Yet each evening he came back carrying a little more, another strip of cloth, another handful of herbs, another portion of broth thinned with water so there would be enough for both of them. More than once he went to sleep hungry so she would not have to, she noticed. He knew she noticed, because she began leaving half her portion untouched, pretending she was no longer hungry. He pretended not to notice back. Suspicion remained between them, but it began to change shape. She no longer flinched every time he moved near her. He no longer felt the need to keep the knife in hand when he slept, when she was strong enough. To stand for longer, she crossed the small room in slow, silent circles, relearning balance, testing pain, mapping exits. Once he came home to find one of his broken stools repaired with neat, brutal efficiency. The joints had been set tighter. "Then he would have managed himself. You did that?" he asked. Her mouth shifted, not quite a smile. "Your furniture is weak." "It was broken. It was human-made," she said, which in her tone explained everything. He laughed before he meant to. The sound surprised both of them. That evening, he tried to make stew thick enough to feel like a real meal. She took one taste, frowned, and asked for the dried red root hanging from the beam. He handed it down, and she crushed it with the side of his knife, adding it to the pot with a pinch of salt and something from a leather packet hidden in her belt. The smell changed at once, warmer, deeper, sharper. He stared into the steam. "You've been carrying spices this whole time?" Her voice held the faintest edge of pride. "Orcs do not survive on boiled sadness." That earned a real smile from him, and for the first time he saw her look at his face without anger. It was brief, but it stayed with him long after the meal was done. The softening came most clearly 3 nights later. Rain hammered the roof, and wind made the loose boards complain. He woke to a harsh sound from across the room, not a shout, but something strangled and broken. She was still asleep, but only in body. Her hands clenched at the blanket. Her breathing came ragged. Whatever dream had found her, it had teeth in it. He nearly spoke her false name, then stopped. Instead he rose, fed wood to the stove, and lit the room with low, steady fire. He sat at the workbench and began stitching an old leather strap by lamplight, making just enough sound for another living presence to exist in the room, without demanding anything from her. Slowly, the panic eased. Her breathing steadied. "After a long time," she said into the dark, "in my clan, watching weakness is a kind of power." He kept his eyes on the strap in his hands. "Then I'm not watching." Silence. Then, quieter. "Why?" He knew what she meant. Why bring her here? Why feed her? Why sit awake beside nightmares that were not his? He threaded the needle again. "Because you were hurt." She turned her face toward him, firelight catching the scars along her brow and the exhaustion still living beneath her strength. "That is a small reason." It was enough. Something in her expression changed then. Not trust, not yet. Something more fragile than that. Something like confusion at finding gentleness where she expected debt. From that night on she stopped, calling him human. She used his name awkwardly at first, as though it was a tool unfamiliar in her mouth. A few days later the danger outside sharpened. At the tannery yard, he overheard 2 men talking about the escaped orc prisoner. One claimed the guards had found broken chain links near the river. Another swore he had seen oversized footprints in the alley behind the cooper's sheds. They laughed as they spoke, but there was tension beneath it. Reward money had a way of making men observant. He hurried home through back streets, pulse loud in his ears. By the time he reached the stairs, dusk had thickened, and the door to his room stood half open. His stomach dropped. He pushed inside. The room was empty. The blanket was gone from the bed. The cup she used lay on its side. For one cold, stupid second, the loss hit him harder than fear. She had left, without a word. Of course she had. Then a shadow moved above him. He stepped back out into the alley and looked up. She stood on the roofline, broad against the fading sky, one hand braced on the chimney, the other gripping the rusted knife he kept by his bed. Beside her lay the leather sheath of her own repaired blade. Her posture was tense, alert, protective. "I heard voices," she said. 3 men, drunk but searching. He stared at her, rainwater sliding from the roof between them. "You could have run." Her gaze held his for a long moment. "I know." She did not climb down at once. She stayed there above his poor little room like a watchful guardian, wounded and proud and impossible. And standing below, soaked through and breathing hard, he understood something had shifted without either of them naming it. She had not stayed because she had nowhere else to go. She had stayed because she chose not to leave. By the end of the week, the room no longer felt entirely his. It was still small, still poor, still patched together from old wood and stubborn effort. But traces of her had settled into it like a second kind of weather. Her cloak, washed and dried as well as he could manage, hung beside the door. Her repaired shoulder guard rested near his tools, its dark metal catching firelight in hard, quiet flashes. The cup she preferred stood near the stove. The blanket he had once folded only for guests now smelled faintly of smoke, rain, and the sharp spice she carried in her hidden pouch. He noticed these changes most in the evenings. Before, he had returned to silence that pressed against the walls. Now he climbed the narrow stairs, listening for movement inside, for the scrape of her boots, for the shift of her weight, for proof that someone else existed in the space waiting beyond the door. He hated how quickly he had grown used to it. Hated even more how empty the room felt on the few occasions she stepped outside before he returned. She had grown stronger, not fully. Not enough to fight a war or outrun a hunting party, but enough to stand without favoring her ribs, enough to lift the water bucket without gritting her teeth, enough to move through the room with that same dangerous grace he had first seen beneath. Chains, as if even injury could not quite teach her body how to be weak. Twice he returned from work to find something in the room improved without explanation. A loose board in the floor had been replaced. The hinge on the window had been reset. Once, the roof leak above his bed had been patched from the outside. With a layer of tar and scavenged slate, he knew she could only have carried herself. When he looked up at the dark, solid line of the repaired ceiling, he said, "You could have reopened your wounds." She sat by the stove, sharpening his smallest knife with infuriating calm. "And yet the roof no longer drips on your face." He almost smiled. "That wasn't my face. That was my pillow." She glanced up then, and something warm flickered behind the sternness of her expression. A tragic loss. That night they ate side by side instead of across from one another. It happened without discussion. He set down the bowls. She moved closer to the fire because the wind had turned mean. There was only so much room on the bench. Their shoulders did not touch, but the distance between them narrowed enough for him to feel the heat of her skin through her sleeve. Neither commented on it. Both noticed. Later, while he stitched a split harness strap by lamplight, she took one of his ruined gloves from the pile of work too worn to save. "This leather is thin," she said. "It was cheap when it was new. In my people's camps, no one would trust their hands to such weakness." "In my people's camps," he said dryly, "most cannot afford better." She turned the glove in her large hands, studying the patched fingertips and frayed seams with a frown that was not contempt so much as disbelief. "You keep repairing things that should be discarded." He threaded the needle through stubborn hide. "That's because some of us don't get the luxury of discarding what still has use." The answer settled between them. He had meant the glove, maybe more than the glove. She was quiet for a long time after that. Then she said, not looking at him, "Among my people, tending another's wounds with your own hands is not a small thing." His fingers stilled. She continued in that same low, controlled voice. "It is not done lightly, not unless duty demands it, not unless blood or oath makes it proper." He looked up, suddenly too aware of every bandage he had changed, every bruise he had touched, every night he had sat wakeful by the fire while she fought pain or sleep. "You might have mentioned that sooner." Her mouth shifted, almost cruel with amusement. "You would have stopped." He opened his mouth, then closed it. She was right, and they both knew it. That seemed to please her in some quiet way. The next day, he came home with split knuckles and a bruise darkening along his jaw. A cartwheel had slipped in the yard. One of the dock hands had called him weak when he failed to lift the axle fast enough. Another had laughed when he stumbled. He had heard worse. Men were always bolder with their scorn when the target was poor enough not to matter. Usually he let it pass. This time, one of them had joked that he looked half-starved enough to be kept as a pet by beasts, and before he could think better of it, he had swung. He lost, of course. When he entered the room trying not to show pain, she was on her feet at once. "Who did that?" "No one important." Her stare sharpened. "That is not what I asked." He set down the sack of flour and tried to shrug, then regretted it when his shoulder flared. Men being men. A silence followed, heavy and dangerous. For the first time since meeting her, he saw rage rise in her, not because of what had been done to her, but because of what had been done to him. Her jaw locked, her hands curled. For one startled moment, he believed she might march into the yard and kill someone with his own hammer. "It's done," he said quickly. "That is not the same as forgiven." Something in the way she said it made his chest tighten, not because it was fierce, but because it was personal. No one had looked angry on his behalf in a very long time. That evening, she ground herbs into salve and pressed it into his bruised knuckles with an attention so careful it hurt more than the fight had. He tried to make light of it. "You're very serious for someone treating a repairman's hands." Her grip tightened just enough to stop the joke. "These hands fed me." He went still. She seemed to realize what she had admitted only after the words were gone. For once, she had no sharp reply ready. The room held a strange, breathless quiet, the kind that comes before a confession and after one too. In the days that followed, the closeness between them became harder to pretend away. She learned his habits, how he rubbed the heel of his hand across his mouth when thinking, how he checked the door latch twice before sleeping, how he muttered apologies to furniture when he bumped into it. He learned hers as well, how she always chose the place in any room that let her see both the door and the window, how she woke at the slightest sound, how she touched the scar near her collarbone when lost in thought, as if measuring an old wound against a new one. One storm-heavy night, with wind worrying at the walls and the fire burning low, he finally asked, "Who are you, really?" She did not answer at once. Instead, she untied the leather cord she kept hidden beneath her collar and pulled free the object hanging there. He had glimpsed metal before, but never clearly. Now he saw it in full. A dark signet marked with the carved jaw of a wolf and a crown of spear points, worked in black iron and silver. Even without knowing the symbol, he understood wealth from the craftsmanship alone, power from the way she held it. The room seemed to contract around that small piece of metal. "Where did you get that?" he asked quietly. "It is mine." He looked at her face, then back at the signet. "You said you were no one worth hunting." "I said," she answered, "that telling you the truth would put you in greater danger. That wasn't your choice to make." For the first time in days, distance entered the room again. He stood restless now, hurt sharpening into something more difficult. "Were you ever going to tell me? Or was I meant to keep feeding you and bleeding for you while pretending not to see what was in front of me?" Her expression hardened, but there was strain beneath it. "I did what I had to do." "Yes," he said, more quietly than anger expected. "So did I." That landed. He could see it. Outside, somewhere beyond the rain and narrow alleys, horses sounded on wet stone. She heard them before he did. Her head turned sharply toward the window. All warmth vanished from her face, replaced by a stillness so complete it felt like the room had frozen around her. She crossed to the shutter in 2 silent steps and opened it just enough to look down toward the main road. Torchlight moved in the distance. Riders. More than a few. When she spoke, her voice had changed. It was no longer the guarded voice of a fugitive surviving in a poor man's room. It carried command, memory, fear sharpened into certainty. "They found the town." He stared at her. "Who?" For a heartbeat, she said nothing. Then she closed her hand around the signet and turned, to face him fully. "If you want to live," she said, "you need to leave before dawn and forget I was ever here." He felt the words like a strike. "Who are you?" Her gaze held his, proud even now, proud even wounded. Then she gave him her true name. He did not understand it at first, but from the street below came a sudden shout, then another voice carrying, through the rain with unmistakable alarm, The name had reached someone else, and this time the whole town knew enough to be afraid. The name spread through the town faster than fire through dry thatch. By sunrise, shutters were closed along the main street. Shopkeepers spoke in whispers. Guards moved in pairs, instead of alone. Even the men who had laughed the loudest in the market now avoided looking toward the cooper's yard. Her true name meant nothing to him the moment she first said it, but to the borderlands it carried weight older than trade and heavier than fear. She was no nameless fugitive. She was the daughter of the Iron Wolf line, war-born blood of the Blackstone clan, a commander raised to inherit warriors, banners, and oath-bound land. Not merely respected, not merely wealthy. The kind of orc whose presence could turn a disputed road into a battlefield, and someone had dragged her into a human square and broken her before witnesses. He stood in the center of his narrow room, feeling suddenly foolish for every small thing he had thought mattered. The patched roof, the extra bread, the quiet talks by the stove. All at once his kindness felt small beside what she really was. Worse than small, childish. He had taken in a storm and mistaken it for someone who might stay. She watched him carefully, as if this reaction hurt her more than she had expected. "I was not supposed to fall into human hands," she said. "If word of what happened in that square spreads far enough, my enemies gain more than my death would have given them." He looked at her then, really looked, and the hurt rose before reason could stop it. So that's what this was. Not just a hunt. Politics. It was survival. "For you." The words came out sharper than he intended, but once spoken they would not soften. He laughed once, quietly and without humor, and dragged a hand over his face. "You let me stand here thinking I had pulled some wounded stranger out of the mud. But you're not a stranger, are you? You're—" He searched for a word big enough and hated every one of them. "Someone with people, armies, a name that makes towns go silent." "And what would you have done," she asked, voice tightening, "if I had told you the first night?" He did not answer because he knew the truth. He would still have helped her. That only made the hurt worse. She stepped closer, her sighs filling the room the way truth now did. "I hid my name because names get men killed. And now I have it anyway." "Yes." He stared at her. "Was I ever anything to you beyond a hiding place?" That landed harder than anger. He saw it in the brief change in her face, the way pride failed to shield something raw underneath. But she answered too slowly, and silence said enough to wound. Outside, voices rose in the alley, not the loose noise of morning labor, ordered voices, boots, armor. The deliberate sound of men who had come with purpose. She moved first, all hesitation gone. She reached for her repaired blade and pushed him back from the window. "Stay away from the shutters." He caught her wrist before she could pull free. "No, not this time. Tell me what's waiting out there." Her jaw hardened. "A rival branch of my clan struck a bargain with human officials along this border. They wanted me taken alive, dishonored publicly, and returned weakened. A dead heir becomes a martyr. A broken one becomes proof she was never fit to lead." The room went still around them. He thought of the square, the shouting, the chains, the way they had made people watch. "You knew," he said slowly. "You knew what they were trying to do to you. I knew after the second day of transport. And still you said nothing." Her eyes flashed. "Because every moment you knew less, you were safer." He let go of her wrist as if burned. "Do not call this safety." A fist slammed against the downstairs door, then another. A voice shouted, for the room above to be opened in the magistrate's name. He took one step back. She took one step toward the door. For one stretched heartbeat, the whole fragile life they had built in that room seemed to hang there between them. The stove, the patched gloves, the broth, the blanket, the firelight conversations that now felt far too tender to survive daylight. She spoke without turning. "There is a loose board beneath the bed, crawl space under the wall. Small, but enough for a man your size. Stay there until they pass." He stared at her. "You think I'm climbing under a floor while they take you? I think you are. Still alive if you do." Another pounding blow rattled the frame. Then a new voice, louder than the rest, barked a name he had heard in the yard before. One of the border captain's hired men. Human, not orc. So it was true. This was not only clan business, it was trade, law, and betrayal woven together. He understood then with a sick, cold clarity that there was nowhere innocence remained in this. He grabbed his coat, crossed the room, and shoved the loose board aside, not to hide, but to pull free the wrapped packet where he kept the last papers from his dead father and the little money he had saved. He tied the coins into a cloth and thrust them toward her. She looked at him as if he had gone mad. "What is this?" "All I have." Her expression changed to disbelief, then fury. "Keep it. If they catch you with nothing, you won't get far. I do not need your coins." "No," he said, voice rough now, "but I need to not." He the sort of man who watches and does nothing twice. For the first time, her composure cracked completely, not with tears. With something more dangerous, feeling. The door downstairs splintered. Boots thundered in the entry below. She took the cloth from his hand, not because she wanted it, but because refusing it now would break something they no longer had time to. Name! Then she did the one thing that undid him. She lifted a hand to his face, calloused thumb brushing the bruise along his jaw, and said in a voice stripped bare of rank and command, "You were never a hiding place." That should have been enough. It should have mended something. Instead, it hurt worse because he believed her. Men were on the stairs. She moved toward the door, blade in hand. He caught her arm again, not to stop her, but because if he let her go in that moment, he feared he would never touch her again. "You can't fight all of them." "No," she said, "but I can choose who pays first." The door burst inward before either of them could say more. 3 men surged into the room, 2 town guards and 1 armored mercenary wearing no town colors at all. The mercenary saw her and smiled with ugly relief, as though collecting a prize delayed too long. "There you are, my lady," he said. "The council feared the public lesson had not humbled you enough." She lunged before he finished speaking. The room exploded into motion. Her blade flashed in the tight space, driving 1 guard hard into the wall. The second rushed him instead, perhaps thinking the small human easier to control. He slammed his workstool into the guard's knees and went down under the man's weight a second later, breath crushed from his chest. Across the room she fought like fury in flesh, wounded, outnumbered, but terrifying still. A warrior forced back into herself by necessity. Then the mercenary changed tactics. He seized him from behind, knife to throat, and shouted for her to drop the blade. Everything stopped. She turned. He felt the cold edge at his neck, the mercenary's arm locked tight across his chest. Saw the way her face emptied of battle and filled instead with something far worse. Fear. Not for herself. For him. "Interesting," the mercenary said softly. "A war heir hiding in a gutter with a human. What story will your clan enjoy more? I wonder, that he sheltered you, or that you let him touch what belongs to higher blood." The insult hit like filth thrown into clean water. He felt her go rigid. She could have fought on. She could perhaps have killed 2 more before they dragged her down. Instead, with a look that seemed to cost her pride, rage, and breath all at once, she let the sword fall from her hand. It struck the floorboards between them. The mercenary smiled. He did not. Because in that moment, held like a weak thing in another man's grip, watching the strongest person he had ever known surrender for him, something inside him broke open with shame. He had wanted to matter to her. Now he did, and it felt unbearable. As they bound her wrists again and forced her toward the stairs, she twisted once to look back at him, not like a commander, not like a noble, like the wounded woman by his fire. He could not bear the sight of it. So when she fought the guards just enough to make them pause and said his name, low and desperate, he gave her the cruelest mercy he had. "Go," he said, his voice hollow. "You were never mine to lose." Then they dragged her away, and the room they had shared felt smaller than a grave. They took her to the old stone court above the market square, the same place where human traders settled border disputes and pronounced punishments loud enough for common people to remember them. By midday, the square below was full again. Word had spread beyond rumor now, not just that an orc noble had been found, but that the captured woman was of the Iron Wolf line, and that a poor human laborer had hidden her in his room like a fool. Too ignorant to fear what he had touched, he was dragged there too, not in chains, though perhaps chains would have been kinder. They shoved him forward bareheaded and bruised, leaving him in full view of the town. Men who had never looked twice at him now stared as though he had become part of a tale too strange to trust. Some laughed, some pitied him, some looked afraid. To stand too near, as if disgrace could spread by shadow. She stood on the raised platform under armed watch, wrists bound again in iron. But she was no longer dressed as a fugitive. Someone had forced her into dark clan armor brought by the orc party that arrived before noon. Black leather reinforced with iron scales, the wolf mark worked across the chest, the weight of command restored to her body whether she wanted it or not. Her hair had been pulled back from her face, the bruises remained, so did the split at her lip. The humiliation of the square had been replaced by something colder, reclamation. At the edge of the platform stood three factions who all wanted something different from her. Human officials wanted peace at the border and profit from whichever orc claimant paid best. Rival orc envoys wanted her brought home obedient, damaged, and politically useful. Her own loyalists, fewer in number, watched with burning silence, unable to act without risking open bloodshed. The man understood then that what had happened to her was not ending here. It was being shaped. A clan elder stepped forward, broad-shouldered and grey-braided, his tusks marked with rings of rank, his voice carried easily over the crowd. "The daughter of Blackstone has been found in weakness," he declared. "Found under a human roof, tended by human hands, hidden in human shame." Murmurs moved through the square like wind through dead grass. The labourer kept his eyes on her. She did not look at the elder. She looked at him. There was command in that gaze, but also warning. Leave this alone. Survive it. Do not let them drag you any deeper into her ruin. Then the rival spokesman spoke next, smooth and smiling in a way that made cruelty sound civilized. He proposed the solution everyone powerful preferred. She would be returned under escort and bound by marriage oath to a rival warhouse for the stability of the clan. Her public breaking would become proof that she had already fallen and needed stronger guidance. The human who sheltered her, if he lived, would disappear into the story as a mistake. The words struck the square cleanly, political, efficient, final. The man felt sick, because for one terrible moment he understood how easy it would be for the world to swallow what they had been. A few official phrases, a few witnesses willing to nod, a few lies repeated with confidence, and the nights by the stove, the bandages, the shared bowls, the way she had covered him with the blanket when she thought he slept, all of it would be erased as if tenderness had never happened at all. Then she spoke. No. One word. Low, iron, absolute. Every head turned. The elder frowned. The rival envoy smiled with the patience one gives a wounded animal. "Your refusal is not the center of this matter." She lifted her chin despite the chains at her wrists. "It is the only center of it. The silence deepened. When she spoke again, her voice changed. It lost the public hardness she had worn since dawn. What came through it now was something rarer and far more dangerous than fury. Truth. "You wish to call me weak because I was taken alive," she said. "You wish to call me unfit because I was humiliated before strangers. Then hear this before. All who stand here, when I was bound, beaten and stripped of title, no clan banner came for me, no oath brother, no council voice, no noble blood. A human laborer with cracked hands and nothing to gain stepped into that square when all others watched." The crowd shifted uneasily. No one had expected gratitude to sound like accusation. She turned fully then, and at last all rank fell away from her face when she looked at him. "He fed me before he fed himself. He tended wounds my own people would have called shameful to. See, he gave me shelter when my name could have bought his death. He spoke to me as if I were not a weapon, not a symbol, not a prize to be traded." He felt the whole square pressing in on him. Heat rose under his skin. Not pride, exposure. He wanted to disappear, wanted to stop her before she made herself. Pay even more for saying what should have remained theirs, but she did not stop. "In our law," she said, now looking to the elders and envoys alike, "to place your own hands upon the broken body of another in their helplessness is not a small thing. To keep watch over their sleep, to guard their weakness, to bleed your own life thinner so theirs may continue, that is not barter, that is bond." A shock ran through the orc witnesses, some with anger, some with recognition. The rival envoy stepped in sharply. "You dare speak of clan bond over a human?" She did not even face him when she answered. "I dare speak truth over men who fear it." The elder's expression darkened. "Be careful, daughter of Blackstone." "No," she said, and now the full force of her command returned, cold enough to split stone. "You be careful. You made my pain into theatre. You dragged me through foreign mud so I could be returned smaller than I left. And now you would fasten me to a husband chosen by cowards who only approached once chains had done their work." Then she did the thing that changed everything. Before the crowd, before the town, before both human mockery and orc judgment, she stepped down from the platform as far as the length of her chains allowed and stopped in front of him. The guard beside her hesitated. No one seemed to know whether to pull her back. She held his gaze and spoke more quietly, though the entire square strained to hear. "In that market, you lied to save me. You claimed me when I was broken because it was the only shield you had." His throat tightened. Her next words struck deeper than any shouted vow could have. "I will not lie now." She lifted her bound hands as much as the iron allowed, not in surrender, but offering. "Come with me," she said. "Not as servant, not as pet, not as pity. As mine in truth if you choose it. I will give you my name's protection, my halls. Fire, land of your own if you want it, a place beside me before all who despise it, and marriage under clan oath, if that is what makes the world understand. I will not let them reduce you. But hear me well. I offer you more than safety. I offer you the life I have left." The square erupted. Humans gasped in disbelief. Orc voices crashed together in outrage. The rival envoy shouted that she was dishonoring blood. One of the elders called the offer madness. Even her loyalists looked shaken, as though they had prepared for war, not this. He barely heard any of it, because all he could see was her, not the armor, not the iron, not the title hanging over her like storm cloud weight. The woman who had sat by his fire and learned the shape of his silence, the woman who had watched him come home tired and made the room feel less empty. The woman who had surrendered her blade because a knife was at his throat, and still he could not answer. He stepped back once, breath unsteady. "Do you know what you are saying?" Her eyes did not waver. "Perfectly. You are offering this. In front of enemies? Yes. You could lose support. Trade. Alliances. Yes. Your people will hate me. Some already do." He shook his head. not in refusal yet, but in pain. And what happens when they are right? When I stand beside you, and all they see is a gutter man you picked up out of pity. What am I in your world except a humiliation dressed as mercy? That landed. He saw it wound her, but she did not retreat from it. You are the only person who saw me without rank, she said, and stayed. He looked away, because that was the answer he feared most. The rival envoy seized the moment. He stepped forward and declared that if she persisted, she would forfeit support from 3 allied houses. A human magistrate added that border treaties could collapse if a claim like this disturbed succession. Pressure came from every side at once. Practical, merciless, real. This was the true test. Not whether they felt something, whether they would bear what it cost. She answered before he could. Then let them withdraw. A sharp inhale went through the square. There it was, the she. Sacrifice, not symbolic, not romantic decoration, real power set down in plain sight. He stared at her, and in that moment he understood that accepting her meant losing the last life he understood, the safe smallness of being nobody, the anonymity of a poor man ignored by history. If he stepped toward her now, there would be no returning to his dim room, his quiet labor, his invisible griefs. He would be judged, hated, watched, tested. He would live in a world built larger and harsher than his own. But if he stepped away, he would spend the rest of his life knowing he had abandoned the only place he had ever truly been seen. Slowly, with every eye upon him, he moved forward, not toward the titles she had named, not toward land or protection, toward her. He reached for her bound hands and held them carefully between his own, as if the chains were the least important thing about them. "I don't want your haul if you do not mean me," he said, voice rough but steady. "I don't want your name if it is only payment for a debt." Her eyes shone now with something fierce and almost unbearably tender. "It is not debt." He nodded once. "That was enough. Then I'll stand beside you," he said, "and let them choke on it." For the first time since the market, a smile touched her mouth, not soft, not pretty, but victorious in the deepest way, hard-won, costly, alive. Around them, outrage still roared. Alliances cracked, threats flew. But the choice had been made where everyone could see it, and nothing either world did next could make it small again. The first weeks after the square did not feel like victory. They felt like consequence. 3 allied orc houses withdrew their support exactly as threatened. Human merchants along the border demanded new guarantees before sending caravans through Blackstone land. The magistrate who had once allowed her public humiliation suddenly insisted he had only followed procedure, then fled town when evidence of his payments surfaced. Men who had bowed to power all their lives discovered they hated truth most when it spoke in public. Her betrayer fell not in a glorious battle, but under the weight of witnesses, ledgers, and oaths he had assumed no one low enough would ever notice. The human laborer noticed. He remembered which mercenary wore no town colors the day the room was stormed. He remembered the seal burned into the leather satchel dropped in the struggle. He remembered which warehouse clerk had lied about a late-night shipment of iron restraints. Piece by small piece, using the same patience with which he once mended cracked wood and split harness, he helped her loyalists trace the payments that tied border officials to the rival faction that had arranged her disgrace. It was not heroic, in the way songs preferred. It was careful, stubborn, humiliating work. It saved her more surely than a sword would have. When judgment finally came, it came before both peoples. Her rival lost claim, title, and the right to speak for any warrior under the Blackstone banner. 2 human officials were stripped of office. One mercenary captain vanished before dawn and was later found face down in a marsh road, though no one asked too loudly how. Peace did not bloom from it, but a line had been drawn that neither side could pretend not to see. She kept her word. So, Did he? He did not become some transformed legend. He remained what he had always been at the center of himself, patient, practical, gentle with broken things. But now his hands shaped more than cartwheels and worn leather. In the stronghold above the river pass, he repaired armor clasps that mattered in council halls, gates swollen by winter rain, saddle straps for wolves bred for war, and once even, the carved wooden chair of an elder who still disliked him, but grudgingly admitted no one else worked as carefully. Some orcs laughed at him, some stared. Some called him gutter man when they thought he could not hear. He heard. Then he kept working. That changed more minds than argument ever could. For her, the greater change was quieter. She still led, still commanded, still wore iron and judgment, like things born into her bones, but she no longer treated tenderness as a weakness to hide behind her teeth. In council, she was feared. In private, she learned to sit without armor near the fire and let silence be peace instead of vigilance. Some nights she still woke from old dreams with her hands clenched and breath sharp. On those nights he never asked for words too quickly. He simply lit the fire the way he had in the little room above the cooper's yard and stayed until the shaking passed. Their home was not the grand hall others expected. She had chambers in the stronghold, yes, but together they remade an old stone house just inside the lower walls, near the workshops and herb terraces where both travellers and soldiers passed daily. It had a wider doorway than his first room, a larger hearth, a roof he no longer had to patch in the rain. Orc forged, beams crossed above shelves lined with chipped human bowls he refused to throw away. Her spear rested beside his leather tools. Dried mountain herbs hung from hooks near bundles of plain river mint. Their life took shape in such things, blended, practical, imperfect, earned. Not everyone approved. Some never would. A few humans still crossed themselves when she passed. A few orcs still looked at him as if love had played some absurd joke on blood and rank. But disapproval lost some of its power when it failed to break what it judged. The deepest change came one grey evening in early autumn. Rain whispered over the stronghold stones, soft and steady, like that first night long ago. She stood at the doorway, fastening a travel cloak before riding out to settle a border quarrel. For a moment, torchlight and weather turned her into the same impossible sight she had once been in his narrow room. Too large for the door, too proud for the pain she carried, too dangerous and too wounded to fit any simple name. He stepped closer and adjusted the clasp at her throat, where one buckle sat slightly wrong. Her gaze dropped to him. "You still do that. You still put it on crooked." A breath of laughter touched her mouth. Then the quiet between them deepened, not empty, full. In the market square, he had claimed her with a lie because it was the only shield he had. It had been desperation, fear, and defiance stitched into 3 reckless words. Now, there was no crowd, no chains, no blood in the mud, only rain, firelight, the smell of wool and iron and home. She laid one broad hand over his wrist and said, low and certain, "I am safe with you." It was not something anyone who had seen her on a battlefield would have imagined her saying. That was why it mattered. He rested his forehead briefly against hers, the way he had learned was an old orc vow of trust, and answered with the truth that had taken them all this way to earn. "You're mine." Not as rescue, not as ownership, as belonging. When she rode out through the gate, she wore his repaired clasp at her throat and his promise in her chest. And when he stood in the doorway watching rain silver the stones, he no longer looked like a man left behind by the world. At last, he looked like someone who had been chosen back.